the Judiciary Committee on the first day of February, and we're continuing to take testimony on H 89. And we have Renee McGinnis of the Vermont Family Alliance. Thank you so much for being here, Renee. And if you could unmute yourself, identify yourself for the record, and proceed with your testimony. Really appreciate it.
Oh, yes. Well, yes. Thank you for allowing me time to testify today. My name is Renee McGinnis. I am a member of Vermont Family Alliance. And Vermont Family Alliance defends the rights and responsibilities of parents and their due process regarding their children at the local and state level. And I'm just going to jump right in and share. I've got three screen shares.
Is she set for screen share? Okay, great.
I'm not seeing, let's see. Yep, nope, two. Okay. There we go. I'm going to start with a statement and review a report. So I've already did the introduction. I have read H 89 and I listened to Legislative Council's walkthrough. Shielding practitioners and persons seeking care against abusive litigation seems to be at the heart of this bill. I will be focusing on shielding practitioners who provide exclusively gender affirming care for minors in regards to abusive litigation. So looking at the bill, pages 4 and 5 of H 89, we have line 14, the gender affirming healthcare services, means all supplies, any mental health, psychiatric, etc. Everything is to support gender affirming healthcare services. And then of course, line 17, 18, gender affirming healthcare services does not include conversion therapy for minors per statute. So while the state of Vermont has adopted an exclusively gender affirming approach to care of minors and youth presenting with gender dysphoria, studies show that there is no international consensus on the standard of care. Also, there's concerning languages on page 4 and 5 under legally protected healthcare activity. These terms by any person on lines 2 and 6. Any person is not defined. And in that regard, it fails to provide protections for minors and usurps parental rights and responsibilities for their minor children. I don't know why my screen is flashing. There we go. So Vermont Family Alliance is opposed to shielding gender care practitioners from litigation that we consider not necessarily abusive when the standard of care for minors in Vermont is exclusively gender affirming. There is no international consensus on the standard of care for minors and youth presenting with gender dysphoria, particularly for birth registered females, a demographic for which presentation of gender dysphoria has grown quite dramatically in recent years. So I'm going to review a summary section of a 112-page, it's called the CAS Review Interim Report on Gender Dysphoria Services for Children and Youth, initiated by the UK National Health Services. Dr.
Renee, before you go ahead, can I ask just a quick clarifying question?
Sure.
That's okay. When you say not necessarily abusive when the standard of care for minors in Vermont is exclusively gender affirming, I'm not sure that I understand what that means as far as that standard of care being exclusively gender affirming. If you could just explain that for me, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
My understanding is, well, if you can't have conversion therapy and there's the resolution to support gender affirming care, we'll probably actually, as we get, well, here it is right there in the language of the bill that I just covered. So any of that care in the text of the language of the bill itself is gender affirming healthcare services. So there's no other options listed there for, other treatments.
No, I appreciate that. So
Counseling.
you're referring back to the definition is what that does.
Gender
Okay, I just wanted to
affirming
clarify. Thank
healthcare
you.
services, yes.
Yeah, I did. I
Does
just
that-
wanted to make sure it wasn't something else. So I appreciate
Yeah.
it. So,
Okay, yeah, sure.
one other quick question, if I could, Karen.
Yes, thank you, Renee. And maybe you touched on this at the beginning and I didn't catch it. I'm not familiar with Vermont Family Alliance. I just tried to look it up as well. Can you share a little bit more about Vermont Family Alliance and your role? And I feel like it would help give context to what you're sharing and what we're reading.
Sure. Well, yeah. Again, we defend the rights and responsibilities of parents and their due process regarding their children at the local and state level. I'm a member and I'm speaking to you today on behalf of Vermont Family Alliance. And I would say that since Vermont Family Alliance advocates for parental rights and protections of minors, by default, every resident of the state of Vermont is a member who benefits from our work.
Okay, so it's a group of Vermonters.
Does that help?
Yeah, it's a group of Vermonters. Is it run by a
Yes,
board?
it is. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's a group of Vermonters. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Vermont Family Alliance. Does
Okay,
that
proceed. Thank
answer
you.
your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So there's no international consensus on the standard of care for minors and youth presenting with gender dysphoria internationally. I already covered that. So I'm going to cover the Cass interim report. Dr. Hilary Cass was appointed by the National Health Services England to review as an independent review of the health of gender identity services at Tavistock Clinic in the UK in 2020. And the study came after a lawsuit against Tavistock was filed. And I just want to touch on some key points of the study that they found, in part that there was a significant increase in referrals to Tavistock's gender identity development services in very recent years, from 2009 to until current. They found that there was a lack of control measures that are typically applied when new treatments are introduced. There was a lack of discussion and consensus on treatment protocols. There was diagnostic overshadowing, meaning that there were other health issues going on with the child other than gender related that were not being addressed. There was pressure on staff to adopt an unquestioning affirmative approach, which is at odds with the standard process of clinical assessment and diagnosis for any treatment, not just gender identity. And in addition, the summary section of this report states that evidence on the appropriate management of children and young people with gender incongruence and dysphoria is inconclusive, both nationally and internationally. And also the review is not able to provide definitive advice on the use of puberty blockers and feminizing and masculinizing hormones at this stage due to gaps in the evidence base. So this is an evidence-based report. So in the UK's only gender identity development service at Tavistock is being sued by people who allege that their children were rushed into taking life-changing puberty blocking drugs. And as a result, they were facing physical and psychological permanent scarring that will last the rest of these victims' lives. That's according to the law firm that's involved. And so the Tavistock Clinic was ordered to close. So Vermont Family Alliance calls upon legislators to study and consider the findings of the Cass Review Interim Report and the lawsuit against Tavistock Gender Clinic, along with detransitioner Chloe Cole's suit against Kaiser Permanente. She went through transitioning starting at age 12 or 13, I believe, and regretted it at the age of 16 and felt like she was, was not given proper care. So we're asking you to look at those things before passing any legislation regarding the treatment of minors presenting with gender dysphoria and incongruence. So we also call upon you to bring in balanced testimony on gender ideology and its impact on minors. And so as we walk through key points of the summary in connection in the summary section of the CAS interim report, I would like to ask you to keep 2 questions in mind. And number 1, what will be considered abusive litigation when there is no consensus on what the standard of care for gender identity services for children and youth? And as you consider whether to advance legislation that shields Vermont's exclusively gender affirming system of care, I ask you to consider recent international findings and that research is ongoing on gender identity care, and that you consider the potential negative impacts on both in-state and out-of-state children, youth, and families and their parents by shielding a system of care, again, for which there is no consensus on the standard of care. So I'm going to skip over to the review. This is the CAS interim review. It's an independent review of gender identity services for children and young people. It came out in February of 2022. This right here is the chair, Hillary Cass. She was appointed by National Health Services of England to conduct this independent review. She is the former president of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. So that's just a quick, I've got a lot to go through, so I'm just touching on her credentials a bit. I'm going to skip down to the summary section. This is the summary section. And just touch on a few key points that I found in this report. So in recent years, there's been a significant increase in the number of referrals to GIDS at the Tavistock Center. This has contributed to long waiting lists and growing concern about how the NHS should most appropriately assess, diagnose, and care for this population of children and young people. Within the UK, the single specialist service has developed organically, and the clinical approach has not been subjected to some of the usual control measures that are typically applied when new or innovative treatments are introduced. So they found that they're not applying typical control measures when they're proceeding with treatments. 1.5 right here, I want you to take a look at that. The review is not able to provide definitive advice on the use of puberty blockers and feminizing and masculinizing hormones at this stage due to gaps in the evidence base. So there's gaps of information on how to proceed, how to treat youth. Recommendations will be developed as their research program progresses. Taking a look at 1.7 here. So at the primary, secondary, and specialist level, there's a lack of agreement and in many instances, a lack of open discussion about the extent to which gender incongruence can be an inherent and immutable phenomenon for which transition is the best option for the individual, or a more fluid and temporal response to a range of developmental, social, and psychological factors. Professionals' experience and position on this spectrum may determine their clinical approach. So there's a lack of discussion, lack of consensus, lack of understanding about what these children youth are experiencing. So what happens is 1.8 children and young people can experience this as a clinician lottery. And failure to have an open discussion about this issue is impeding the development of clear guidelines about their care. So it depends on which clinician you get, is how the youth or minor will be treated. Back up to 1.10 up at the top. The mix of young people presenting to the service is more complex than seen previously, with many neurodiverse and or having a wide range of psychosocial and mental health needs. The largest group currently comprises birth registered females first presenting in adolescence with gender-related distress. And I hope to show you a graph shortly about just how much that has changed. Uh, 1.14 at the top corner, primary and secondary care staff have told us that they feel under pressure to adopt an unquestioning affirmative approach, and that this is at odds with the standard process of clinical assessment and diagnosis that they have been trained to undertake in all other clinical encounters. So with the gender care, they are not addressing they are not approaching gender care the same way they would any other clinical encounter. 116. Another significant issue raised with us is one of diagnostic overshadowing. Many children and young people presenting have complex needs, but once they are identified as having gender-related distress, other important healthcare issues that would normally be managed by local services can sometimes be overlooked. Page 18. I want to look at international comparisons. 1.20. So the Netherlands was the first country to provide early endocrine interventions, known as the Dutch approach. And although GIDS initially reported its approach to be early endocrine intervention as being based on the Dutch approach, there are significant differences in the NHS approach. So within the Dutch approach, children and young people with neurodiversity and complex mental health problems are routinely given therapeutic support in advance of or when considered appropriate instead of early hormone intervention, whereas criteria to have assessed therapeutic support prior to starting hormone blocking treatment do not appear to be integral to the current NHS process. And then this existing evidence base 123. So evidence on the appropriate management of children and young people with gender incongruence and dysphoria is inconclusive, both nationally and internationally. While Vermont is taking on a gender affirming approach only. Yeah. 126. Internationally as well as nationally, longer-term follow-up data on children and young people who have been seen by gender identity services is limited, including for those who have received physical interventions, who were transferred to adult services and or assessed private services, or who desisted, experienced regret, or detransitioned. There's lack of follow-up, limited data. 128. So much of the existing literature about the natural history and treatment outcomes for gender dysphoria in childhood is based on a case mix of predominantly birth registered males presenting in early childhood. There's much less data on the more recent case mix of predominantly birth registered females presenting in early teens, particularly in relation to treatment and outcomes. So there is some history with birth registered males presenting the classic case, birth registered males presenting in early childhood, very early childhood. And now we have this exponential growth of birth registered females presenting later, not in early childhood, but in their early teens. So I think that's all I want to touch on from the summary, but I want to show you the chart that shows the growth of cases in the case mix. So let me scroll down there. I need to shrink this a little bit so you can see all of it. A little bit more. So this is the chart that this report showed. So this orange right here is female registered at birth. This is the exponential growth right here from 2009 to 2016, it looks like. So where it used to be male children, not adolescents, but children presenting, it's now switched to adolescent females. So this is, and I think, what needs to be looked at is what's at the root of this. Why is there a different case mix now than historically? I think there needs to be asked that question before people just jump in, clinicians just jump in and start treating them. And a lot of that has to do, I think, with the mental health, et cetera. I'm going to switch to section 3. This chart is in section 3 of the report. So there's a link to this report in my opening statement document for everyone to access. I think Nina shared it as well. And, I hope you do take the time to look through this document yourself. Section 4 of the report. They actually listened to patients, parents, and clinician and took their information and collected it together. And that's in section 4 of the report. But back to section 3, I wanted to show you something about hormone blockers, puberty blockers. So the administration of puberty blockers is arguably more controversial than administration of the feminizing and masculinizing hormones because there are more uncertainties associated with their use. There is no standard of care. There's been considerable discussion about whether the treatment is experimental. Strictly speaking, an experimental treatment is one that is being given as a part of a research protocol. And this is not the case with the puberty blockers because the GIDS research protocol was stopped in 2014. At that time, treatment was experimental and innovative because the drug was licensed for use in children, but not specifically for children, but specifically for children with precocious puberty. This was therefore the first time it was used off-label in the UK for children with gender dysphoria. So if a drug is used off-label, it means it is being used for a condition that is different from the one for which it was licensed. The many uncertainties around the off-label use were recognized, but given that this was not a new drug, it did not need Medicines and Health Care Products Regulatory Agency approval at that time. So 326, the important question now, as with any treatment, is whether the evidence for the use and safety of the medication is strong enough as judged by reasonable clinical standards.
So, Renee, do you, I want to make sure that there's some time for any questions as well. And we definitely have this document on our website.
Yep.
Do you have a few other points that you want to make there, just so I can open it up in case there are any questions?
Sure, yeah, one more point,
Okay, go ahead.
332 here, and then, yeah. A closely linked concern is the unknown impacts on development, maturation, and cognition if a child or a young person is not exposed to the physical, psychological, physiological, neurochemical, and sexual changes that accompany adolescent hormone surges. So it's known that adolescence is a period of significant changes in brain structure, function, and connectivity. During this period, the brain strengthens some of its connections and cutbacks on others. There is maturation and development of frontal lobe functions, which control decision-making, emotional regulation, judgment, and planning ability. And animal research suggests that this development is particularly driven by pubertal sex hormones, but it is unclear whether the same is true in humans. I think we need to find that out. If pubertal sex hormones are essential to these brain maturation processes, this raises a secondary question of whether there is a critical time window for the processes to take place, or whether catch-up is possible when estrogen or testosterone is introduced later. So yeah, that's it. Any
Great. So
questions?
once you can stop sharing your screen, and then we can see if there
Sure.
are any questions. I appreciate it.
Sure.
So any questions?
I have one question.
Yeah. Just let's wait for okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Barbara.
Hi. So I understand that the American Academy of Pediatrics actually does talk about these treatments in their standards of care.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I thought you said there weren't any standards of care treatments. So the American Academy of Pediatrics is a reputable, evidence-based, research-oriented, journaled organization that I just consider them pretty solidly based in science and practice and trials. So they do address these types of procedures as part of what they consider the standard of care. Do you not recognize them?
I recognize that they have established standards of care. I'm saying nationally, I'm saying internationally, there is no standard. And that may be the American Academy of Pediatrics and all these other United States medical organizations that might have what they have determined standards of care. I think that they need to look at this interim report and take it into consideration and reevaluate their standards of care.
Thank you.
I don't rely on just one source only. Yeah.
Appreciate that. Are there other questions? I think you've given us a lot to ponder with this document. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Find it here. You were talking about puberty blockers, I think. I'm just wondering how they would work on, say, differently on a young girl and a young boy. I guess the different drugs, I'm gonna assume that there's different drugs that maybe even for a female, it's a aromatase inhibitor.
There's some side effects covered in the report. I don't have the screen share right now, so I can't, it should be, there are side effects to these drugs. And it is in the report. You know, and they've made it pretty clear that the results of puberty blockers are unknown on females because it's only more recently that, how do they say, birth registered females in their early teens are presenting. So there's limited data on the effects of these drugs. They're kind of experimenting. They don't have any long-term data. Did that answer?
Yeah, kind of. Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Angela.
Hi, Renee.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. So I'm looking at the summary and interim advice, and I see right on the first page, kind of called out in this box for us, it's a gray box in our printout, that says every gender questioning child or young person who seeks help from the NHS, which is the UK's health service, must receive the support they need to get on the appropriate pathway for them as an individual. And one of the ways I look at the bill as written is that it's seeking to do just that, to protect the ability for every gender questioning child or young person seeking help to get on the appropriate pathway for them as an individual.
Yes.
So I'm a little, not confused, but wondering what you might say about that. Do you see the bill differently than the way I just described it, or the intent of the bill?
The intent of the bill is
That it is actually trying to protect the pathway that this study that you're sharing with us actually calls for.
but it doesn't, yeah, so I agreed with that statement in that little green box on page 15. Appropriate pathway for each individual. When Vermont is adopting a gender affirming approach only, it excludes all other options. It means all psychiatric care, all medical care is geared toward gender affirming only. That's not addressing each individual. That's a one size fits all protocol.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? Any other questions? Thank you very much, Renee, for being willing to appear and
Thank you.
for your helpful testimony. And I guess we'll hear from your colleague tomorrow afternoon.
Yes.
Though we don't have quite as much time to spend with her because of some other people coming in, but we'll definitely hear from Carol as well. Looking forward to that. So
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you for taking my testimony. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
You too.
Yeah.
We'll go offline 10 minutes because we don't